So I'm putting this up from the end of the last part of the lesson. So this is the end of part one, where we looked at Freaky Fred and Kooky Carl and their extreme right and left, respectively, ideas that really have a broad impact on the late 19th century, particularly 19th century American labor and 19th century business practices. But let's go back for a second and look at in between the radical left and the radical right. There's a better way to do this. And we started talking about this yesterday. So let's follow this up. When the founders of our country set things up, what they looked at was in writing the Declaration of Independence, this idea that they all agreed on and understood that there were inalienable rights, rights that could not be taken away because they came from a creator. Now, obviously, the fact that they emphasize that there is a creator is ultimately different than what Carl and Friedrich would believe, a century later. The Constitution established and set up 6 purposes for government, and it wrote and put in a Bill of Rights that sort of harkened back and guaranteed for people's reassurance that they had these rights that came from God. It put it in writing so that nobody could argue that you didn't have them because there was nothing written down that said that you did. Because the founders recognized that eventually this might become a problem. But the question comes up of what is the best thing for the people? Do you do government? Like, as far as government, do you do democracy or republic? Well, as we talked about in our flipped lesson, the founders were terrified of the idea of democracy. They felt that it was a road to tyranny where the majority would lord its power over the minority. And they were in favor, obviously, of limited government. However, the Articles of Confederation that they were operating under were really limited, but they did nothing. Economically, do you go with a market that is more or less free of government involvement, or do you go one where the government is really super in charge and active of everything? And last but not least, and this is a big one here, I'm going to change color even on this one. This issue of property, the property question, okay? We're going to make it blue and pink to represent the fact that it involves everybody, men, women, boys, girls, you name it, okay? The question of property. Removing even Jefferson's, pursuit of happiness line, part of that pursuit of happiness is your ability to own and profit off of private property. And it goes to a fundamental question of what kind of government gives the best opportunity for people to have access to property. What kind of government best guarantees the ability of people to obtain property and to pursue happiness and to reflect the rights that they've been given? Well, it's not a political philosopher really who puts this forward as much as it is an economic idea, okay? And there's a lot of different political philosophers, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, that influenced um, American thinking and creating the government. But we're going to look at one person in particular who is an economic philosopher. And that person, go over here and erase this. That person, that would help if I did that, is this rather charming looking man. Okay, I ain't gonna lie. He's kind of terrifying. I'm not saying he's a bad person, but I'm just saying based on how he looks, his house would be the one that I make sure I walk up to the door with my kids at trick or treating. Just saying. This is Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote an incredibly influential book. That book is known as The Wealth of Nations. It was published in 1776, not coincidentally the same year that the revolution really kicks in with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Most of the founders read Adam Smith, and he had a very profound impact on their view of how to create government. Adam Smith is considered to be sort of the founder or the father of free market capitalism. So, what is free market capitalism? Well, free market capitalism, let me go over here on the pen. Okay. Free market capitalism is the idea that there is very little restriction on trade. Now, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and I'm going to underline the book here. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith looked at societies throughout history. And his conclusion was that the societies that offered their people the best opportunity for happiness and the best opportunity for prosperity, in fact, the ones that were the most prosperous, were the ones where the governments stayed out of the economy and let people trade how they wanted to without restriction, letting them to decide for themselves, creating a system of capitalism where everything involves the exchange of money for goods and services. He proposed an idea that he referred to as laissez-faire economics. Now, I apologize for my horrible French pronunciation. By the way, if it sounds like, well, that sounds like lazy, it is kind of. That's where we get the English word lazy from. It literally means hands off. Okay? Laissez-faire economics is the government keeps itself out of the economy and lets the economy run itself. The government worries about providing for protection and keeping open the means of allowing people to engage in economic activities freely. Americans ate this stuff up because we looked at it, and a lot of Smith's arguments really were the basis for what we had the disagreements with England about. The fact that the English were over-regulating our markets, not letting us make money freely, basically making us like a serf state or a vassal state to them, that we were put in a sense of servitude to the English crown. And the Americans really looked at this as the definition for the way to go forward to create a happy, prosperous nation. The British government, by the way, with very few exceptions, really had no use for Adam Smith's stuff. Now, the irony of this is after the American Revolution is over, they adopt much of his attitude towards economics, leading to a period of approximately a century plus, so roughly to say about a century, where Great Britain becomes the dominant world power economically, politically, and militarily. And they create an empire that dinky little island ruled over 25% of the world's landmass and approximately 50% of the world's people at one point in time. The real other irony of this is that had the British government really bought into Adam Smith's philosophy and logic early on, they may have actually been able to hold on to America. But as it turns out, they didn't. And America itself based much of the way that its constitution was structured economically on the ideas of Adam Smith. Now, this is where we are going to end for part one. In part two, we are going to look at what exactly is the free market. And we are going to look at and see the relationship in post-Civil War America between business and workers, and how and why the influence of people like Nietzsche and Marx felt their way into America. Overall, good job, peace, and love.